everybody, this is Hua. Welcome back to my YouTube storytelling channel. Today I am here to read to you part 9 of Plig. I hope that all of you are staying safe in this winter snowstorm that we have had. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. He sat in the darkened study as AiniSua made her way with the dark glare. He was made aware of her absence at Mai Sia's wedding, and his heart was filled with questions. As she came in, he noticed that her pink dress had splatters of blood on the sleeves. He stood up and walked around the desk that separated them. For the longest time, he had hoped that he would never have to burden himself with traitors within his own family. And today, he was forced to think he may have it, not in his men-at-arms, but in his daughter. AiniSua, he said. AiniSua blinked, and then she shrugged her shoulders. Her face broke into a horrified look. Hussein ignored the fake concern in her voice. AiniSua smiled, but it did not hit her eyes. She turned to go, and Hussein pulled his sword out, extending it to her. But she turned around and threw 2 small daggers that hit his upper arm. He dropped the sword and stumbled backward as she came forward. He felt the poison make its way into his veins, and he let out a haggard breath. AiniSua, he muttered. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at him. She grabbed the jade pot of tea and threw it on the ground. It broke and scattered across the room. Hussein coughed, and blood began sputtering from his lips. AiniSua laughed as tears ran down her cheeks. Hussein let out a deep breath. Yeah, she cried. AiniSua turned and walked out as Hussein managed to get up slowly, only to fall back down again. Mai Sia woke to the sound of trays clattering, and she turned around to find servants putting fruits down before her. Her shoulder was sore, and she sat up slowly as Pavo entered her room with a tray of fresh bandages. The conversation with her husband last night came back into her memory, and she stood up as Pavo came to steady her. Mai Sia, Pavo said. She turned to her handmaiden. One of the servants who was setting the fruits down turned and looked at her. Pavo said. When Mai Sia arrived, Su was standing before the target haze with a bow and arrow in hand. He was dressed all in black with a green belt around his waist. He was too handsome, and she hated it. She made her way to where he stood, and he smiled at her. Cô tụi mình go nha. Cái sợ là cái bụi bụi rọc thia. Thảo chiều anh mà cô chỉ tao là bố cái bụi mà. He said as he winked at her. She held her hands in fists at her sides as she glared at him. Yeah, cô sao cho Molly nào vậy cô yên con có lo lợ. Smiling, he set down his bow and arrow and walked to her. With one instant, he reached her and pulled her into his arms. When she tried to move, he warned her. Ju. Cái tí yêu cũng có lo. Yeah, cái bình đạo và cái lúc hàng cái nón đồ đó, cái yêu chả cái tí yêu tao. She didn't answer him and stilled. Cô bảo. Nhưng chỉ nhớ con đã cô tí lúc gì nó. Cô chỉ đùa. Cô cho cái khí cô khởi tao đau xong. Chỉ bắt đầu cô chỉ nhớ từ tu lúa. Cái chỉ tao cho cái khí, thế cho cái tu xuyên đấy tu nên rong đi cô. Cái lo được cái lú, đó cái rong non rong ná. Để sĩ cái chỉ bảo hạt để cũng chỉ cái chân nghiệm bảo tử. Cái gì gan tăng gan neng, tôi lúa tan đầu của chuyện neng chỉ chạy tu. Tu mình nhỏ mà á tôi chỉ cho hai lú, cái gì chỉ sao mà cho xia cho tôi xí. Cái gì chỉ cứ xí lăng tư lệ. Cái bảo mà cô lú xuyên bảo tử. Mai Sia began to cry. Cô xí, nếu chỉ trong này cho lú có hai có. He turned her around to face him. Cái sao để cái gì đó hù nó bao bây giờ. Cái sao để cái gì sát tệ chỉ tao lon trả lên nó lo. Cái lúc họ mua. Nhưng bỏ ra chỉ sợ lợ. Cái thế đi lợ nông cô. Sao tao tao nhận mà. Bây giờ. He pushed her to the ground and she sobbed. She slammed her hands into the ground and looked up at him. Yeah, cô gì tao ở đây ya. Ở tôi cái chuyện nâng ta lợ. Cô bảo ở tôi tháo gì đâu cô gì. He laughed and bent down on one knee. He tilted her chin to look up at him. Có lo lù sư. Chỉ trong giàu của xia. Thảo tư của tao có gì lo lù tháo thế có gì trả tay đó cô mà. Cô mà lý tỷ xa hai tè cô bây giờ gì tao. She broke from his hold. Cả lù họp pia. Đó cô bây giờ chị. He stood and pulled her to stand with him. When she tried to move away from his hold, he grabbed a hold of her chin and moved close to her, threatening to kiss her. She stilled and remained silent. He smiled. Cô tư tao cô lù họp pia lợ. Cái tí của tư là nè. Sao nhiều xia. Cô yêu khí cái lúc họ mua có bỏ ra kế đá. Rất xua tù nhau họ cái lúc này. Bí đã có gì tùa. Glaring at him, Mai Sia said, Lư rào, cô yêu tùa có tùa kiên đà. He laughed. Thọ xìa miệng gâu nhá. Cô chỉ tùa giống nhìn bảo lý có xá. Chỉ có yêu thọn tế thọn đau lọ. Cô yêu yêu có nhá một ta ít xia ít xì, một ta ít tiền nâng nè. Cái sao vả kia. King Su smiled, and then he pulled her to him. He watched as her eyes danced with a fear he recognized all too well, and he laughed. He reached out and touched her cheek, making her flinch and turn away. He leaned in close to her and whispered, "Cái sao chú lý cả trái Plig của tây giả cả luôn dâu thao của cô đồ nè." And with that, he pulled her, put his lips over hers, and gave her a kiss. Jillian placed the wet towel over her husband's forehead, and concern etched across her face. It had been a few days since he had fallen ill, and no physician could determine what was going on. He had been coughing up blood and had an on-again, off-again fever. Nkauj stood in the corner with her hands folded over each other and stared like a guest. She looked up at the woman, and anger filled her. "Nkauj, cái chỉ bảo sao lại cả? Cái ở chỗ này có được khó à?" Jillian said. Nkauj looked up with no emotions in her eyes. Ít gì chỉ hốt tay lúc có sự, thế này khó có sự này. Thở rong lên đâu là này kề, chuyện có cụ bắt tu thế sao đã chi nó. Có tí hạt được một lần bay quan tu rong này chế, có cụ tu. Jillian stood up, anger shooting through her body. Nkauj, cái chuyện một chai là hai lý có thế lọ. Xe lưng từ bố lú vào lú chế đâu cần nhỏ. Xe lưng từ bố máu đâu cần nào nè, khai lọ. Jillian, Hussein said through a soft whisper. Jillian gasped and lowered herself next to him. He coughed, and Nkauj, disgusted, turned and walked out of the room. Jillian's eyes filled with tears as she held her husband's hand. He managed to bring her hand to his chest. "No guai," he whispered. "Muhai ka Mai Sia tot shai ko. Ku mo lun tao ya ku ya hai do nữa. Ta xin ho, mua yên yo nhớ trong hẹn. Chỉ son chen hơi từ hồ lú vào lú trẻ nó." Jillian's heart dropped. Cái hai đã chi nó. Tu lọ cụ chia từ khoa. nhớ tụi nhỏ rồi co. Trên cụ, đi thấy cái tụi khen nó mà. Mua hai cả Mai Sia tua cả tao chỉ cụ, sứ sứ. Cụ mà khai chơi ya, cái lúc rồi chỉ lo giàu ấy luôn đã nó. Nhớ Mai Sia tí lên, tí li ở yên lỡ sứ. Một giờ cụ tuần sai tôi sai cụ. Cụ muốn tao ya cụ ya khai nữa. AiniSua brought the darkened pot of liquid into her room and had just closed the door when she saw a movement that made her turn around. Standing in the corner of the room was Mamong, wearing all black with eyes that were silvering. AiniSua set the pot down and grabbed her sword, pointing toward the woman. She only cackled as she came out from the shadows. AiniSua asked. Mamong smiled as she lowered her eyes and gazed at the pot of liquid on the table. The truth, the pot of liquid held pig's blood mixed with raw hearts from a baby calf. When mixed in well enough for time, and added with a potion she'd stolen from Chengdu's home, it would kill anyone who dared stop her from doing what she needed. It would be a poison that slowly ate up the heart and body, turning their mind against them. She hadn't intended on using it against Mamong, but now it seemed like a good idea. Can try long? AiniSua asked with a grin. Mamong smiled and she walked forward. Guchin chai. Ya có bao. Cú yên sơ tí ya thia. Có xá tên chê có đi cú yên gì nó bỏ. Ôn tê có yếu xá tìa có yếu yên. Thó có đặc anh nông có tự khưng hả tìa xin lăng tì tò đã chỉ chẳng kính tới con điệt tù. AiniSua frowned, and then Mamong removed the strand she'd cut from AiniSua's hair. She brought it out, smiled, and then she tossed it into her mouth and chewed. Cheng leng cheng kya cheng ba cheng du, lun tu qua lun tu reng, niên nu na cú tàu cá cú tàu kế, cú tàu tinh cú tàu tu. Rậu na dễ cú cheng cú qua cú cheng cú yên, cú yêu tàu xuôi ya nhớ hỗ trợ nhớ hỗ trả, mi nắng tệ mi nắng tớ, mi cho mi trả mi chư mi pli ya cú tinh ya cú tu, ya cú tinh ya cú tu ya cú tinh ya cú tu. AiniSua felt her hands get hot, and then she fell to the ground and began to feel as if worms were crawling inside her. She coughed and gagged, and then tiny little maggots began spitting from her mouth. She screamed and ran to the corner of the room where Mamong came to her and knelt down. Gu tu hai ka hai tia, gu tua con chu, gu tua ka pli. Nu tu ka yo a pe do gu, ka yin yo kia chi di. Zhou no lo, ka yo pa hai tia gu heng bo li ja. And then she grabbed the dark liquid on the table, opened up AiniSua's mouth, and poured it down her throat. It burned her insides, and she curled up into a ball, shaking as Mamong laughed and flew around the room. Zhou no lo, mình câu hóa tài, có yếu bảo hai tia ô lúc nâng nọ cho ná yếu trong lý cả. Có yếu ba cho cụ tia sĩ cụ yếu Mamong, chỉ một lần tia yếu cho tàu cụ. Sĩ cụ tia ya, có yếu ô lúc nâng yếu to yếu kia. The sun had begun to make its way down the horizon when AiniSua stirred. Her mouth was crusty with dry blood, and her heart was pounding. Her body had been covered in sweat, and her hair was matted with some sort of dark liquid that she couldn't figure out. She felt the strength gone from her body as she slowly pushed herself to a sitting position. She looked around the room, and her eyes caught something white turning on the floor. It was a little maggot flipping back and forth. Very slowly, she reached out and picked it up, and then put it inside her mouth. She felt the salty taste explode inside, and she moaned out of pure pleasure. She stood on shaking legs and walked to the mirror. There, she saw that her lips had turned black, and her eyes were darkened. Her cheeks held tiny spider veins that seemed to pulse and move on its own. She cocked her head, staring, and then a smile spread across her face. The door to her room opened, and her mother walked in, stopping halfway, frozen with fright as she stared at her daughter. AiniSua, She asked as she came closer, slowly with a fear that lit up her eyes. AiniSua smiled, and then she said in a low voice,
Nia, Kapanchaiku.
Gojong stopped walking and remained still. With one swift move, AiniSua moved across the room and grabbed her mother by the throat, lifting her from the ground. Gojong groaned and tried to fight her daughter's hand. AiniSua threw her across the room, and she crashed into the mirror, breaking it into tiny pieces. Moaning from pain, Gojong stood and tried to recover from the impact. AiniSua slowly walked over and then picked up a piece of the mirror.
Nia, Tika Kotelli no. Tika Saisi Kashimohamua. Got a demolike. You could walk or got some pocket.
She grabbed her mother by the throat and began to stab her mother in her eyes as Gojong began to cry. The drawbridge had opened, and Mai Sia rode through on her horse as she flipped over the animal and landed on the ground. She felt the pain from her shoulder, and she knew she tore her wound again. She didn't care. She rushed inside and found the castle hall to be completely empty. Normally, her father was in there reading the daily report. It had an eerie silence, and she felt her heart sink. She heard horse hooves and turned around to find Nkauj making his way in. His eyes carried on a deep hatred, and she was ready to battle with him if need be. He asked. She cried. He cocked his head to one side. Before Mai Sia could answer, a blood-curdling scream came from above them. Nkauj rushed past her and she followed him. As they reached the upstairs of the upper part of the castle, blood was smeared across the walls. Nkauj stopped and Mai Sia almost toppled over him as he reached out to steady her. Mai Sia asked in shock. They heard laughter coming from the king's chamber. Slowly, both made their way in, and to their utter surprise and shock, AiniSua was sitting there with a piece of glass slowly cutting her father's arm. Her mother was laying in the corner with a bloody forehead, and Gojong laid in the far corner with both her eyes dug out. Mai Sia screamed, and AiniSua turned around with a blackened face. She stumbled backward, and Nkauj caught her. When she tried to fight him off, he caught her arm and steadied her. Mai Sia, Mai Sia turned back to look as AiniSua stood up, limping with a crooked back toward them. And then she laughed and began twirling around, dancing, flipping her hair back and forth. Mai Sia saw that her father was still breathing, although faintly, and her mother was blinking, which meant they were both alive, but Gojong made no movement. And she knew right away whose blood covered her sister's entire dress. AiniSua, Mai Sia asked. She turned around swiftly and yelled, As she rushed toward them, Nkauj removed his sword and swung, removing 2 of her fingers. She howled and dropped the glass to the ground. He put his hand in front of Mai Sia and shoved her toward her father, where he turned around to make sure he was standing in between her and her sister. AiniSua laughed as she held up her bloody fingers. And then she laughed and squeezed her hand where blood squirted, and she sprayed it all over herself. Mai Sia screamed in shock as AiniSua came charging toward them. With one swing of his sword, Nkauj took off AiniSua's head, and it rode to the side where it landed with her, having a smile still on her face. Mai Sia fell to the ground as Nkau's men-at-arms arrived in the chamber. He ordered. Mai Sia sat in the room with her weakened father in the bed. She was holding his hand as he opened his eyes slowly and looked at her. She smiled as tears fell down her face. See, Kunyano, sunshine. Kanyane, he asked softly. Kunya puta lutsako. Kunya chiolika. Kutsi. Wachao. Tawg kusha. Hussein reached out a shaking hand and brushed away her tears. Kutaminsai. Sakoa. Omingo nyachichia sa elukum hodosha plume. Mai Sia let out a sob and threw herself on her father. Kutsi. Kaya chuchi wachamo. Inshallah, ekweja karakamuche. Kuya talan takanyo. Hussein smiled. Minsai. Kuyichi walikama. When she pulled away, the burning question she had on her mind was asked. See, kutanung kaila. Puya kanta kaneng. Utsa ichining dolala. She watched as her father's smile faded, and it answered the question. She bit her lips as tears slipped down her cheeks. When she tried to stand, he grabbed her hands. Mai Sia, katsan zuku. Thalo kenda. Cô chỉ ya tu cho lu của cô, cô chỉ nhớ thứ tu lúa, cô chỉ một bánh xử lý này nọ, cô những tàu ở đây. Mai Sia shook her head in disbelief. Cô chỉ, các bà bảo hay để chuyện này các một sao tu nông đó, ya các tu vào chuyện này nè. Hussein's face broke into disbelief as he sat up and stared at her with tears in his eyes. Có hại đi cả? Mai Sia removed herself and stood up from where she was kneeling and turned away. Tawg su hay khai cô sai tên nữa đa sư. Từ xíu cha nữa cho lưu, nữa hại những một chân. Ê từ lăng gì của báo giới từ lăng gì chỗ sao? Có chuyện mua sai, có từ võ đại đâu, có từ võ này nó êm ấy. Mà lúc lì trong này đại ở có mua thế? Đại có mua ấy lon trả lì nè. Mai Sia, đó có ra gì đâu cô. Cô giới thì tụt đó. Yellow got go or go in or. She turned around, anger filling her. So you the chia là cái ô lo. You vì đi cả. Tụi mi ở giàu tụi bắt nè là có chán ta chán để nghi cho tan thôi. Cái là tao lúc mày rồi thì cái ấy tụi chỉ hốt tay một mình mỏ xứ. Thì chỉ có ra cánh cửa chỉ phi có luôn chơi luôn mua. Mai Sia, Hussein cried. How có ra gì đâu cô. With a sobbing voice, she said. Tụi có yêu lần thiệt cái ra gì. Ni chia cô à. Ni aku tu si ni aku tungka. Nu cô bắt tao hai tia. Kinh số lo luôn nữa hai đứa cũng một chân. Cô chỉ bảo cô ya sali kia ta lia cô si. Cô chết tao cả. Li thấu là. Xin nu nào mu. Chết cả thế cô. Yêu ôi anh cho. Thank you for tuning in to Janju Jai Plig Part 9. Part 10 will be out shortly.